And so once again, hello and welcome to this webinar. I'm Vicki Culpin, and I'm going to be with you for the next 45 minutes or so, talking to you about what is obviously at the moment an extremely important and very topical subject. What I'm hoping to do is be able to think about our current situation and what that means for adapting and thriving, but also thinking beyond the current situation and what we can do differently when this passes, and of course it will, we hope very much so, pass, and what we can learn from it and how we can help build our resilience and how we can help adapt ourselves and the people that we work with going forward to build a better, more effective, more resilient community around us. So before we move on, I just want to, sorry, I do seem to be having a problem with my, there we go. So Ashridge and Hult work together with their EF. We're part of the world's largest private education company. And what that means is that we're able to service a whole range of different needs, from language training and the cultural exchange programs and educational travel, from the EF side, from the business school side, which is Hult, and then of course from the Ashridge side, which is around executive education. My home, as it were, is at Ashridge in terms of executive education, but I also work across Hult and into the EF business as well. And it's fantastic to see so many of you online today, to hopefully learn a little bit more about this topic, and of course at the end have the opportunity to ask some questions. As has already been said, the Q&A box will be open. Feel free all the way through this webinar to ask any questions that you'd like to. I'd love to have conversations with you personally, but obviously with the size of the audience today, that's just not possible. But I'll do my best to take some of those questions and answers when we get to the end. So before we start, I'd like to just hear from you in terms of a quick poll. So what I'd like you to think about is, what do you feel the effects of the current global pandemic will be on the personal resilience of the people that you work with, so the employees in your organisation? Do you think that having gone through and survived the current situation, that your employees will actually increase their resilience? Do you think it won't change it? Or do you think that the toll physically and mentally on experiencing and going through these next few months will actually significantly reduce their resilience? So if you just let me know which of those you think applies, it would give me a really good feel for how you think the current situation is going to impact when we look forward, when we think about our employees' physical and mental health in the future. Interesting. Okay. So there is an absolutely, I say, overwhelming majority of people, just trying my mental arithmetic, so 84% feel that actually having experienced and certainly survived what's currently happening in the world, that will actually increase individuals' resilience, which I think is an extremely positive message to hold on to. It's often very difficult when we're in times like at the moment to believe that this is actually going to help our resilience. But I think it's a really fantastic signal from you guys that you think that the people around you, and hopefully yourselves as well, will actually benefit from this in terms of your resilience. And we're going to touch on that when we move through the slides. So when I was preparing for this webinar, I was looking back at some slides that I'd prepared over the years, and I came across this one, which I thought just puts things into context. So this was a slide that I used in 2016, based on a piece of research done by the World Economic Forum, and it was part of their Global Risks Report in 2016, where they basically looked at the likelihood and impact of a whole variety of different potential world crises. So what were those global risks? And interestingly, and not surprisingly, they were obviously highlighting and focusing on those that they thought were high likelihood and high impact, which is that box there. So things like water crises, fiscal crises, cyber attacks, interstate conflict, and so on. What I thought was really interesting is, and for those of you that have got very good eyesight, you'll be able to see this on the diagram on the left-hand side, is spread of infectious diseases falls into a relatively low likelihood, a very high impact, but a relatively low likelihood. Now, the world would be so much simpler if we could act with hindsight. Of course, we can't see what's coming, and that's what makes it so difficult to predict. But what my point really here is that no matter how we think we're able to control the world, control the resources, control our immediate environment, there will always be things that come along that take us by surprise, maybe positively, maybe negatively. And no matter how much resource and intelligence we put into predicting these things, the world is by its nature an unpredictable environment. And as we know, that's going to get more so as we move forward. So never more, I don't think, has it been a pertinent time to really think about resilience and what it means to be able to actually thrive in a situation where we don't necessarily know all the answers. Just to tie this up before we move on, this is also from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, and where they focus on the spread of infectious diseases, which is that slightly salmon pink colour, you can see that they believe that that is a risk in virtually, maybe a tenth of the world, certainly not what, if we were to plot that graph today, would look like. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is the world is unpredictable. It is unpredictable, it is uncertain, and that's often an uncomfortable position for people to be in. And what we want to do is think about, what does this therefore mean? What does it mean for me and for you and for our physical and mental health at this moment in time? Because it is absolutely vital that we pay attention to that. But equally important, I think, is what does it mean for us in 3 months, in 6 months, in 12 months down the line? What can we actually do to support ourselves and our employees moving forward to ensure that we don't lose the lessons that we've learned, that we don't lose the compassion that we're starting to develop and share between ourselves at this point in time, that we don't lose our understanding of how important resilience is, how important showing our vulnerability is, and that we take the lessons from this and make our organisations a better place for it, because I think this is an incredible opportunity, as well as understandably a very uncertain and potentially worrying time. So we often in business schools, and certainly in organisational life, now talk more and more and more about this idea of VUCA. This idea that the world is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And I think never before has that phrase been true. We are absolutely at the heartland of experiencing VUCA at the moment. However, I would also say, from my side, from working in this field for many, many years, over 20 years, I think that the acronym also stands for something else. And I think it stands for a very useless concept alone. And what I mean by that is that it's all very well and good for us to label a phenomena, to look at something in the world and say, yes, this is VUCA. We're experiencing a VUCA world at the moment. Organisations are volatile and the world is complex. But actually, from a really pragmatic and practical viewpoint, giving something a label doesn't help us navigate it. So actually just having the concept alone is not very helpful. It's not very helpful for you. It's not very helpful for me. It's not very helpful for our organisations or the people that we work with. What we need to do is understand what we can do about it. How do we navigate it? How do we survive through this? How do we come out in one piece? How do we survive and thrive physically and mentally, not just learn what a label means? And hopefully in the next 45 minutes or next sort of 30 minutes or so now, I'm going to give you a few tools and a few tips to pay attention to make sure that this isn't just a concept on its own, but actually there's something practical and pragmatic for you to reflect upon. So, for those of you that haven't seen this graph before or something similar to this, this was designed by a guy called Ralph Stacey. And Ralph Stacey had what I think is the most fantastic job title in the world. He was called a professor of complexity. And he basically believed that every business decision, and in fact, actually every decision we ever make, personal and professional, sits on a line between high and low certainty and high and low agreement. Some decisions that we make, we're fairly certain about, and if we shared them with our colleagues or our loved ones, most people would agree with us. They sit in what Stacey called ordinary leadership, but I would say actually it's also management. It's things like performance management. It's tasks where we do the same thing day in, day out. It's often data driven. It's often numbers driven. It's decisions where they're very simple, very straightforward. And if we have the right data and the data is clean and accurate, there's relative agreement and a relative certainty it's the right thing to do. Now, in the top right-hand corner, there's something that Stacey calls extraordinary leadership. And this is where there is no agreement and no certainty. And I think we're living in that world today. If you read an article by an expert on the current situation of the pandemic, you might read 5 or 6 different opinions about what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. There's no certainty and there's no agreement. And that's when we need that extraordinary leadership. Now, I would say that actually all leadership sits in that top right-hand bucket. The minute that we start to deal with human beings, the minute that human beings start to interact with each other, they are unpredictable in fantastic ways, but also unpredictable in more difficult ways too. The fact is that leadership isn't about data and number crunching and turning the handle. Leadership is about that top right-hand box, embracing the fact that actually in the current climate and going forward, there will be times when we don't have the answer. And what does that mean, therefore, for us? And what does that mean for leadership? What does it mean if we spent all of our time and effort and training and focus and organisational culture around that ordinary leadership, when actually what we need now and what we need in the future is the extraordinary? That ability to sit in a position where we don't have the answers, where we're not sure what's going to happen, when we can't make 100% informed decisions, when we might feel absolutely out of control, like we do currently. But we have to sit with that and we have to lead through it. Now, if we think about that top right-hand box, what skills do we need to be effective in that? And another way of thinking about it is, what skills do we really need at this moment in time to help us negotiate through the current situation? And therefore, what do we need to pay attention to in the future to make sure that the people that we work with, who work for us and we work for, have these skills to enable them next time to thrive again? Well, if we look at the literature, this is what the literature suggests. We need to ensure that we are self-aware. Do we know where our pressure points are? Do we know what excites us and what makes us passionate? Do we know what a good day at work and a bad day at work looks like? Do we know how we deal with challenge and threat and lack of control? It also talks about leading with confidence when we're uncertain. And that's not arrogance. Arrogance and confidence are, of course, two very different things. Confidence is also including showing your vulnerability. It also talks about leading through collaboration and influence, and not necessarily just leading from the front. That idea of the heroic leader, of leading through the front and taking charge, that's all well and good in a crisis, as maybe you could argue at the moment. but actually going forward, we also need collaboration. You think about currently how much collaboration is going on across industries and with industries to find hospital beds, to build ventilators, to think about food deliveries, to look after the vulnerable. That collaboration, I would say, is going to be a real key strength of leadership going forward. However, if we look at that list, there is one thing that I think covers everything on that list. One thing that is more important than any single thing on that list. And it's very simple. It's resilience. If we do not look after ourselves physically and psychologically, if we do not look after others physically and psychologically, then we will not have the resources available to do all of these good things. And that is in the immediate term, but it's also in the future. I think, and I would say this because this is my research field, but I think that building physical and mental resilience is absolutely critical in today and in the future. And it's not selfish to think about your own well-being. Often when I work with leaders in this space and I talk about resilience and I talk about looking after yourselves, they will feel that that's not what they should be doing, that they should be looking after other people, that they should be concerned about others' welfare. And yes, of course you should, and that's fantastic to hear and to see. But also, you need to look after yourselves. And that is really important because you are as important as any other single person in your organisation. And I want to just stop for a second and share a story on this because I think it's a really important point around looking after yourself. Because even if you want to be very organisationally focused, the brutal truth is if you are not performing at your best, then they, whoever they are, your colleagues, the people that you report into, the people who report into you, they will not be performing at their best. So even if you want to think it from an organisational perspective, looking after yourself will help your organisation. But also thinking about it from a personal perspective. So I was working with a group of participants at Ashridge a few months ago. And at the end of my session, a participant came up to me and shared a story which he said he was happy for me to share with others. And he said that his father gave him a life lesson. When he graduated from university, his father took him out for dinner and shared this lesson with him. He was about to do the same to his daughter. And it's a lesson that I think is really profound and something that we shouldn't lose sight of, particularly really difficult times. And the lesson was this. His father said to him, "Never forget how quickly your organisation will replace you if you were to die. And never forget how impossible your family will find it to replace you if you were to die. Use your energy accordingly." And I think that's very profound. Now, as an organisational psychologist working with organisations, you might think that's an odd thing for me to emphasise because it's putting the self above the organisation. But the fact is that if you put yourself and your loved ones first, you will bring your best self to work. If people are able to be compassionate towards others in their immediate circle, they will be able to be more productive at work. So it isn't selfish to think about yourself in these tough times. It isn't selfish to think about other people in these tough times. It will help your organisation. So please focus on yourself as much as others. The other reason that focusing on yourself as much as others is important is because of something called emotional contagion. When we are with people who are in a good, positive, emotional space, it is contagious. It is psychologically contagious. We actually feel better, but it's also physiologically contagious. We can actually have physical changes in our chemistry, in our secretion of hormones that actually makes us feel better too. Equally, if we spend time with people who are in a bad space physiologically, who perhaps down or depressed or their resilience is low, that also has an effect on us too. We can feel physiologically, we might feel down or depressed, And in addition, physiologically, we often will actually secrete cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So actually being in proximity to these people can make us feel more happy or can make us feel more low. Now, interestingly, in preparation for this seminar and given where we are in the world today, I did some research, and these effects are found even when we are working virtually. So even if we're doing something and we're not in the same physical space, but if we can see each other on Zoom, or we can hear each other on Skype or FaceTime or whatever platforms we use, that emotional contagion still sticks. Now, this is a really important point, because what it means is how you are feeling at this moment in time can change how others feel. And that, I think, is a very, very positive message to take away. It means that if we pay attention to ourselves and we pay attention to others' emotional state, we can start to change organisational culture, because there is a ripple effect out from you and from them to other people. And it also means, of course, that we need to pay attention to people who aren't in a good physical or psychological state, because that also has a ripple effect too. Now, I've talked a lot about resilience, but what does it actually mean? Well, if you were to go onto the internet and search for a definition, you might find something that looks like this. This concept is taken from the natural sciences, from the physical properties of a material. And it's the idea that if we stretch a material and stretch it to breaking point, it will get to a point just a nanosecond before that material shatters or breaks. And that is the resilience of the material. Now, I think that using that as an idea about what resilience is actually quite damaging, because I certainly don't want to work for an organisation that stretches me and stretches me and stretches me to a nanosecond before I break. I want to work for an organisation that's more compassionate than that. I want to work for an organisation that doesn't feel that it's okay to take me to that brink before it looks at my resilience. And I want to share another story with you before I come to what I think is a more appropriate definition of resilience. So for those of you that haven't heard of Antonio Osorio, he is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Lloyds Banking Group. And in 2011, at the height of the financial crisis, when the banking system was having an extraordinarily difficult time, he had a breakdown. And it was a very public breakdown because he was very honest and very open about it. And he spent 9 days in the Priory, which is a clinic in London, and he spent 8 weeks off work. And since then, he's spent a lot of time sharing his story. What I like about this quote from an article in the Times Magazine in 2017 was, I think in 3 paragraphs, he's summed up for me what I think is the absolute essence of resilience. So he talks about feeling that he was Superman, that he could do it all. He talks that he felt that he could just sleep less and work harder. That was a positive thing to do. He talks about the fact that being a chief executive is a very lonely job, and that it's important actually to reach out and build your networks. And he talks about the importance of learning from this and sharing what is learned from this. And he certainly has done that. But if you take that list, I think that really kind of epitomizes for me what we need to pay attention to in resilience. There is something around delegation and control. When we are feeling under pressure, when we are feeling that our resilience is very low, control becomes very, very important. And I'll talk about this again in a second. But when we feel the need to take control, what tends to happen is we stop delegating. We micromanage. We take all the tasks on ourselves because we want to show that we are demonstrating our worth, and we want to feel in control. And of course, when we're feeling under pressure and our resilience is low, often we need to delegate more. We need to ask for help. We need to allow others to help us, because taking more and more on is actually counterproductive. We also need to feel that showing vulnerability is not the same as making it look like we can't do our jobs. Asking for help is such a key aspect of leadership and a key aspect of resilience. When somebody asks us for help, it makes us feel very valued and very honoured that they've asked us for help. Yet why is it so difficult for us to ask others for help? Even if you want to think of it from a purely pragmatic point of view, asking others for help will make them feel included, will make them feel honoured and valued. So even if you don't do it for any other reason, reaching out in that way will really help other people. What I want to do now then is talk about what I think is my preferred definition of resilience. And the reason I like this idea of psychological resilience is it underpins for me a really important message. And that is every single person that you deal with, whether it be your loved ones, whether it be your people at work, deal with stress, with pressure, with circumstances differently. How you perceive the world, how you feel, how you deal with uncertainty and change will not be the same as how somebody else deals with it. Now that sounds really obvious, but when we're under pressure, we often think that how we feel is how everybody else feels, but actually that's not the case. We might be feeling absolutely overwhelmed and very scared and very worried. Somebody else might actually at that point in time not be sharing those feelings. They might be feeling a little bit optimistic, or they might be feeling absolute terror whilst you're feeling a little bit more in control. What's really, really important for you and for the people that you work with is to understand for each of you, what are your own resilience protection factors? What are those key things that you need to keep dear to you that will enable you to get through? And the list isn't that long. There is 15 of them. If you look at the literature, there's about 15 different physiological, psychological, or organisational aspects to resilience. Now, I've divided them into physiological, psychological, and organisational. The physiological ones speak for themselves, and I'm going to focus on sleep in a minute. The psychological ones, they are inherent in you, and they are independent of the organisation. So it doesn't matter what organisation you work for, whether you're self-employed, whether you're currently not employed, they're inherent in you and are agnostic, as it were, not related to the environment you're operating in. Then there are a list of those that relate to you psychologically and your organisation. So things like control and influence. How much control do you feel you have in your organisation, and how much influence? Now, outside of this webinar, because obviously we don't have time at the moment, but what I'd really like you to do is to take this slide and the next one that looks at those organisational, physiological and psychological factors. And think about, maybe not currently, because I should imagine currently you are all under significant amounts of pressure or stress. But think about a time when you perhaps weren't under so much of this current situation. And take each of those different protection factors in turn. How important are they? So let's take sleep. Maybe when I'm feeling pretty good and pretty resilient and life is okay, maybe my sleep is pretty good. Maybe I would score myself 4 out of 5. But when I'm under stress and pressure and my resilience is low, perhaps my sleep really struggles, really suffers, and I might score myself 1 out of 5. Now, for some of these things on the list, let's say optimism or your family and friends network, maybe they are always good and remain good even when you're under pressure. Maybe they're always bad and remain bad when you're under pressure, and diet and exercise might be one of those. Perhaps you never get quite as much exercise as you like, and perhaps under stress that doesn't change. But for each of you, you will find that there'll be 3 or 4 from this list, from the physiological, psychological and organisational list, that you find a big change in numbers, so that you might have scored yourself 4 or 5 when you are not under stress or pressure, and that drops dramatically to maybe 1 or 2 when you are. This is just an indicator, a barometer as it were, to suggest that they might be protection factors for you. They might be things that you want to pay attention to when you are under pressure, such as if you are currently, and make sure that you don't lose sight of those. So if your sleep isn't important, and normally you get very good sleep, and you're now thinking that actually it is being eroded, it is poorer than it should be, I would suggest that be something that you perhaps focus on. Maybe your family and friends network is very important to you, and currently that's difficult to maintain, and therefore it's now scoring 1 or 2 with that. Again, stop and think about how you can operate within the current environment to maintain that as closely as possible. Same with exercise, or same with your sense of control. It's just a way of starting to think about what are those things that keep you physically and mentally healthy and that slide a little bit when you're under pressure, because those are the things that you need to pay attention to. And the way I think about resilience is like having a bath. There are things that will enable us to look after ourselves, which are the things that are equivalent to turning the taps on and filling that bath with water. Some of them will be equivalent of turning the taps on full blast. Some of them will be more of a trickle, but they will help you fill up your resources for resilience. And there are some things that happen that are the equivalent of the plug being pulled out of the bath and that drain your resources away. And it's important that you pay attention to those as well and make sure that you're mitigating against those as far as possible. Another thing that I want to focus on is something called the circle of control, because I think this is so pertinent now, but it's also critical going forward when we're thinking about resilience more generally going forward. When we're under pressure and under stress, often one of the first things that people will report to me is that they feel out of control. They feel they have no control. Now, what of course happens then is that we focus more on the things that we can't control, and that makes us feel even more a sense of being out of control. As you move up the organisation, by definition, you do have more control over things. So a sense of lack of control is often emphasised for those people lower down the organisation too, which is also worth considering. So what can you do? Well, a really quick task or exercise that you can do for yourself or for the people that you work with is just think about what are those things you can directly control at this point in time. What are those things you have direct control over? And there'll be a whole variety of them for you. Then the next circle, as it were, is what are those things you can't directly control, but you have some influence over? And again, a whole list of things. And then the final circle will be what are those things that currently you cannot control and you cannot influence? And I'm sure that circle will be full of a lot of really important things. But the point is, when we're feeling down, when we're in difficult times, when we're feeling our resilience is low, we need to focus on that control and influence circle. And as far as possible, let go of the things that we have no control or influence over. Now, I appreciate that that's extraordinarily difficult to do. And I'm not for 1 second suggesting that we should never worry about these things. But what I'm saying is that for ourselves and for our colleagues in difficult times, focusing on those things we can control or influence are really, really important. Now, I thought another thing I want to focus on is the costs of poor sleep. I think for myself, and this is a big area of research for me, when we are struggling with resilience, our sleep often is one thing that either becomes poorer, we struggle with, or we forget about because we are very busy and pressure is tight. Now, at the moment, I should imagine many of you are having difficulty sleeping or getting to sleep because of worry. But often going forward, one of the things that people will often report to me is that they're not getting enough sleep because they're not allowing themselves enough sleep because they are too busy. They're working long hours, spending time with family, and their sleep is impacted. And I just want to reiterate how important sleep is for looking after yourself. We know, for example, that getting less than 6 hours sleep a night can really significantly impact your physical health, really actually start to have some serious physical costs. So, for example, things like your blood pressure. It increases your blood pressure, increases your risk of type 2 diabetes. And also, interestingly, just catching a common cold, very topical at the moment, is much more likely because our immune system does become depleted. Now, I appreciate that at the moment, sleep often may be difficult to come by. And what I would say is, this is something that I would really pay attention to. Think about how you can improve your sleep and check in with other people too. Because interestingly, when we get poor sleep, it actually impacts not just our physical health, but our whole view of the world. We find that we lose track of things. We find that we have a very negative view of the world. We become more distrustful. We find it difficult to read facial expressions of people when we are tired. Now, given that at the moment where most of our business is going to be operated on virtually, that ability to read facial expressions of individuals is going to be critical because we're not in the same physical location. We're going to lose a lot of those non-verbal cues that we rely on. So that ability to be aware of others is so important at the moment. How are they feeling? What are they not saying? How do I pick that up? And those are the kinds of things that actually poor sleep really affects our ability to do. I think another thing that's worth flagging up, and this is particularly important at the moment, is when we are tired, when we get poor sleep, our entire view of the world becomes more negative. What tends to happen is our memory becomes poorer, but it isn't our memory for everything that becomes poorer. It is our memory for positive and neutral events that tend to become poorer. Those are the things we tend to forget. But our memories for negative events, we tend to still remember. That means that we have a negative bias to the world. We also tend to have lower mood when we are tired, or find it more difficult to regulate our mood. We tend to have less positive experiences when we're tired. So what actually happens is not only do we feel poorer, but actually our view of the world becomes more negative. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It also has a significant impact at the organisational level. So it affects things like job satisfaction, logical thinking. It means that if people are still at work and still, for example, in factories, frontline staff, there's an increase in workplace injuries when people are tired. So regardless of what your other protection factors are from that resilience barometer, I'd also suggest this around sleep is really important to do. If you go on the Hult Ashridge website, there are a number of articles by myself that will give you some indicators about some of the things that you could perhaps do to address some of the issues that you may well be having around this right now. So I just want to go back to that list of skills that I talked about that we need to survive and thrive now and in the future for the next uncertain challenge that businesses will face or will face personally. And my question to you is this: how prepared are your leaders for this? How much do we think about this in organisational culture? How much do we recruit and train for this in our leadership? How much do we focus on these types of processing behavioural skills as opposed to things like strategy and marketing and finance? Because I would say that I think we're facing the next big career derailment. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of career derailing, when individuals move from technical to management skills and from managing to leading and from leading to strategic positions. Often some people will derail. They're not able to let go of their technical skills to become better managers. They're not able to let go of managing to become leading, not able to let go of leading to become more strategic. I think we're now looking at a situation where we have another potential career derailer. And that's for leaders not to understand the skills needed to operate in this increasingly complex, unpredictable world. All those skills that we've been talking about. And the fact is very simple, that what has got us here will not get us to where we need to go. We need to start thinking differently. We need to start looking to each other. We need to start showing compassion. We need to think about what our organisations of the future need to build in that resilience, so that we don't have to experience a situation like we have and like we are currently to build our resilience. And it's fantastic that 84% of you said you do think you will come out of this stronger and more resilient. But we don't want to need to experience that to build resilience. We need to build this into organisational culture. We need to develop our leaders of the future to have these resilience skills. And don't think that it's okay to do this from a bottom up. We need leaders across the organisation. This is a quote from Nietzsche: all things are subject to interpretation. whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. Those individuals that have the power in the organisation will dictate the truth in that organisation. So we need leadership across the organisation to show vulnerability, to show compassion, to help build resilience, because that is what organisational culture needs. So finally, what do we do? I think the first thing is we focus on the small choices we have. We might feel we don't have control. We might feel that we don't have any influence at the moment, but we all have some small choices that we can make. Focus on those small choices and appreciate the choices we have. We also need to foster a positive well-being culture. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone, can sit in the body for between an hour and a half and 2 hours, whereas oxytocin, which is the happiness hormone, can take 5 or 10 minutes before it's depleted out of the body. That means that we need to pay attention to the good stuff, because that disappears physiologically so much more quickly than the stress hormones that sit in our body for longer. We also need to pay attention to that emotional contagion. Being in a good space or being in a negative space can and will affect organisational culture. And we need to make sure that we don't have bystander apathy. What I mean by that is that we don't need to say, somebody else will do this. It's somebody else's job. Somebody else is better equipped than me. Somebody else has the role. Somebody else has the resources. Don't be a bystander. Take the opportunity, take the challenge and make a change today. Don't let it be somebody else's responsibility. The next one is important too. Absence of data is not data of absence. Because you don't have data on how people are feeling doesn't mean to say it isn't anything to be concerned about. Reach out and get data. Talk to people, share your stories, share how people are feeling, because getting that data on the mood is really, really important. And never forget how much power you have as leaders, that you have to make a difference, that you have to change your organizational culture, and that you have to look after yourself and your family. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you've taken something away from it, even if it's a small change that you can make today that makes a difference to you, to your loved ones, and to the people that you work with. I hope it has been helpful. I'm now going to just, in the last minute or two, maybe just take one question, because I appreciate that we are very tight for time. I would also like to flag up that this has been a bit of a taster for our Hult online offering. Please feel free to go to the Hult and Ashridge website if you're interested on any of our Hult online offerings. Many faculty such as myself are running 2-hour webinars on a whole variety of topics. Please take a look and see what might be useful to you. They are really fantastic resource, particularly in the current situation. So I'm just going to take a couple of questions. A very quick one, which is a relatively simple one to answer, is why is more than the healthy limit of sleep dangerous? That's a great question. And the reason is that when people get more than the healthy limit of sleep, or the healthy guidance of sleep, then it is often correlated with other ongoing health conditions. So it's often that people are struggling with their sleep in terms of getting too much sleep because they have other health conditions, which is significantly impacting their health. So it isn't necessarily the sleep itself, it's just that that length of sleep is a symptom of a more difficult, a different health condition. The question about what have Cambridge Judge been paying attention to that the World Economic Forum haven't, I think the World Economic Forum have been paying attention to the pandemic, but obviously they put it slightly lower in terms of their risks. I'm sure they will be readjusting that as we speak. I'll take one more. The quote about function of power, not truth, was by whom? Nietzsche. That was by Nietzsche. And I'll take one more before we need to finish. From my perspective, how important is compassion in relation to resilience? I think it's absolutely a key component, an absolute key component. The ability and the willingness for you as a colleague to reach out to somebody else in your organisation and show compassion is, for me, one of the signs of heroic leadership. If you think about leaders that you will go the extra mile for, leaders who you will do an extra 10 hours a week at work for in a crisis situation, leaders that you can remember from 10, 15, 20 years ago, they're the people that showed compassion. They're the people that cared about you on that human level and made that human to human connection. So a final word from me going forward is stay safe, stay well, look after yourselves and your family and your colleagues, and show compassion. Thank you very much.